Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this year's Merthyr Trades Union Council S.O. Davies Memorial Lecture. Can't see you all with my glasses on. The last time we had anyone from the RMT was Bob Crow in 2013. So I think we've been an awful long time without having some input from the RMT. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mick Lynch.
Well, hello, good afternoon. I haven't plucked you all away from your Saturday afternoon shopping and football results or whatever else people get up to these days, but it's very nice to see you all. And thanks for the welcome for the Trades Council. It's nice to be here. I feel like I'm on a perpetual tour of the country these days. I don't know why. I'm the only trade unionist that people seem to know who they are. That shows the state of our movement. But thanks very much for the invite. And I've got to state, you're always taught to state your connection with the area. And it is a bit tenuous, but I am from Paddington, as I was saying earlier. So it's the other end of the line. And we had Welsh chapels in Paddington when I was a lad, and more than 2 or 3, I think. And we've still got a Welsh language school down in Hanwell where I live, so there is a connection. But of course I'm very aware of the history of Merthyr, Tydfil and the valleys and South Wales as part of our movement, and of course I've got some awareness of S.O. Davies. It seems like a very strong character. It seems like he was born and bred here and took some of his tenacity from the valleys and delivered it into Westminster and in everything that he did as a trade unionist, as a socialist, as a politician, and as a non-conformist. And I think that's probably the best word for him by what I've read. And he believed in that, the ultimate thing, that his job was to represent the people that he came from, rather than worry about the political party and the power of the whip, as they say in Westminster. And I can see Beth here, who's had some experience of that lately, about the discipline of the Labour Party lately. And it's a shame we haven't got some more people in the Labour Party these days that are prepared to stand up for what our people need and what needs to be done in our society to get us back to where we need to be. So my background, if you want to know, is very similar to many of yours. I was just speaking to one of your activists there about his background doing an apprenticeship at Hoover's. I did an apprenticeship. I left school in 1978. I know that's hard to believe looking at me. It was a very easy job I had. When we had factories in London, remember those? We had factories all across the country, even in West London where I was brought up and born. I was born into an Irish working class family on a council estate. Remember we used to build council estates back then? We were the 4th family that moved onto our council estate. It's called the Warwick Estate, right near Paddington Station. And it was full of working class people, very obviously, and it was aspirational at that time because we came from very poor housing conditions. I'm not going to get the violin out, but that was just the way our life was up until the early 60s when we built those facilities. We came from multi-occupation housing, sometimes called tenements, but just terraced houses divided into family dwellings where you had to share the toilet and you had the tin bath. And I was the last of 5 kids. But my parents had come from Ireland during the war. And it says a lot about the economy in Ireland at that time, that it was better to go to the Blitz in 1941 and stay in Ireland because it was better there, and of course there was work. And it was a great community, and I'm sure this community, when it had full employment, when we expected our life to be structured around the world of work, when we had the services that we believed in, built by our government and by our movement after the war, and of course the big build-up to that through our labour history going back to the Industrial Revolution to deliver that stuff. I came from a very similar background to most of you, I believe, in a slightly different situation in a big city, but our culture as working class people and as a working class movement was very similar. My dad was a shop steward. He came over from Ireland and was digging the roads. He was almost a caricature Irishman in more ways than one, I can assure you, but he was always in the trade union, always active, and that's the way we were brought up. We were brought up in the Catholic Church and in the trade union movement and in the Labour Party, and many of you will have had a similar experience to that, maybe under a different set of faiths or whatever, but that was the way we were. I believed everyone was in a trade union. I believed everyone was interested in our movement. I thought everyone was Irish, even with my accent, but there we go. Kilburn and Paddington were the hotbeds, and it was a very diverse culture, and I believe it held us together. There were a lot of people from abroad, a lot of people migrating to find a better life, not just from the Caribbean and from the Indian subcontinent or wherever, but also from all over Britain. There were lots of Welsh people, there were lots of Scottish people, there were Geordies and Scousers and all the rest of it. It's one of the ironies today in Britain that nobody immigrates hardly anymore for internal to the United Kingdom. You don't meet people from Liverpool, you don't meet the Geordies and the people from the shipyards coming down and from South Wales. And I work with a lot of people from South Wales, and they taught me a lot about trade unionism when I started. So that's where I came from, and I believe one of the tasks in front of us as trade unionists and as socialists, as political activists or whatever, is to rebuild our culture, to rebuild our interest in what we do and rebuild our movement. And part of that is the heritage of our movement. And I know you've got lots of things going on in Wales and Merthyr Rising and the other festivals, but they are popping up all over, with Tolpuddle, with the Burst and Strike School over in East Anglia, and in Ireland there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment. I spoke at the Mother Jones Festival, was a famous Irish trade unionist who went to America and helped found the trade union movement there, but in my background, James Connolly and James Larkin and all that stuff. And there are dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of examples of people that gave their life to our movement and built the things that we believe in and built the very structures that we have as a trade union movement. And of course that led to the welfare state, the social and welfare state as I like to call it, the pillars of what we believed in. And of course the NHS and the model for it was formed in this part of the world under Nye Bevan's patronage or sponsorship or whatever you like, and bringing those ideas of cooperation and lifting all the boats together to a national forum and making it the programme of our movement. And that's where we've got to go as far as I'm concerned. And I think a lot of us think we've lost our way. In a lot of our working class communities, just walking around, seeing the loss of vibrancy, I suppose, in our communities, the loss of identity, the loss of culture, and seeing people with their heads down looking at their phones night and day doesn't help when you're trying to do that. So I'm very glad you've still got a Merthyr Labour Club. I'm glad that you've still got a lefty forum, from what I've been hearing just now, speaking to a couple of people, that people are still interested in what we're trying to achieve and still interested in where we're going to go. And the last few years has been interesting, I think. And the RMT and myself, we've had quite a high profile, which is I suppose why you've asked me to come and speak to you, but we've had quite a high profile going back to the post-COVID period, and that was an interesting turning point, COVID. Of course it was horrible. It was a thing that none of us will forget, and well, some of us will probably want to forget it quickly. We had a lot of losses in our community. We had a lot of horrible stories, people who are still suffering from the effects and the trauma of that. But one of the things it did do, I think, it showed to us all and showed to the world who really creates the wealth in this society. And the early socialists, if you read those books, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist by Robert Tressel, which I'm sure many of you read, and all the other books, the message they're always putting is that workers make all of the wealth in society. And wealth isn't just money. Of course, we all need money to get by. It's the very structures of what we live in, the infrastructure, the hospitals, the schools, the music, the electricity that we're all using, whatever, the water that we hope is going to be clean at some stage in the future. All of that is created by workers, and nothing gets done without workers. And what COVID showed, when all the derivatives traders and all the foreign exchange traders and all these people manufacturing clever instruments in the City of London, when they all had to be confined to their Berkshire stockbroker belt houses, the world had to go on. And it was the people at Tesco's, the people in our hospitals, the people working in the sewage works, the people working in the electricity generation stations, whatever, workers of all kinds of descriptions, and often the very lowest paid people in our society. And we all know about the care home scandals. Care homes are a constant scandal, not just during COVID. But all of that demonstrated to us, I think, again, that it is actually the working class that moves the world. And after that, of course, the Tories didn't learn anything. Labour didn't learn too much. But the Tories' model, which is the model we live under now in modern capitalism, is outsourcing, is privatisation, the 0 hours contract, precarious work, as they call it, which just means you don't know where your next hour's work is coming from sometimes. And those of us that are older, my generation, always expected to have work where you had a contract of employment, where there were a set of rules and regulations, collective agreements, hopefully, that would govern how you work. People below my generation, I'm not talking about people very young, people in their 40s, people in their 30s and 20s, and those leaving college and school now, they never expect to have what I had when I left school. They never expect to have what we had at the height of industrial power in Britain. They expect, I think, to be living in a precarious, insecure world. And somehow we've got to remake our workers' movement, a movement that can deal with that precariousness. And of course there are a number of ways to do that. We have to go out and organise, like our forebears did. We have to go into these gig economy places, these sweatshops that are reappearing all over the country. We have to go to people who are working in hospitality and retail and all the rest of it, which seems to be one of the biggest sectors that we have these days, and find ways of organising them into trade unions. And the trade unions themselves have to adapt to that. We have to stop being a club, the trade unions, of people in certain jobs. So those of us that work in local authorities, or the health service, or the railway, or wherever, we're fortunate. And we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure that we don't become an aristocracy of labour, as they used to call it, where the craft unions were dominant, and the rest of the workers, the labouring classes and women, people in semi-skilled or non-skilled work, as it used to be called, were left behind for many years by our movement. And there was a big change at the end of the 19th century where we had general unionism, new unionism, because work was changing with mechanisation and the new manufacturing techniques that were brought in. And we have to get back to that, because the world has turned, but people are being left behind. So one of the messages that we're giving, and I try to give it to the TUC, and if you want to give the TUC General Council a message, you have to poke them in the eye generally about what's going on, because persuasion or embarrassment doesn't seem to work. But where we were after COVID as railway workers and transport workers is that I think the Tories had us in their crosshairs in particular, because you mentioned Bob at the start, you mentioned the profile that he had, and Mick Cash was before me, but we had Jimmy Knapp before that, if you remember, the great Scottish railway trade unionist, was again one of the most high profile trade union people in the country. They had us in their crosshairs because they saw us as some kind of enemy. And we are an enemy, we're a class enemy of the Conservative Party, there's no doubt about that. But what we've managed to do on the railway, even with privatisation to a large extent, and not completely successfully, is keep the structure, keep the idea that you've got your contract of employment that has been negotiated, keep the idea that you're going to collectively bargain on your wages. And many people now are subject to pay review boards rather than direct collective bargaining. Keep the idea that your working time, when you work, when you go to work, or how you're deployed, is subject to negotiation. It's very important for transport workers because we work 24/7. And all of that stuff, holiday pay, sick pay, extended leave, being retained when you're unwell and all the rest of it, we had great agreements. And they saw us as the prime target because they thought that we'd cause them a lot of trouble. And we were. And they brought in the minimum service level of legislation, specifically targeted at railway workers, specifically targeted at my union, I think. And we were quite concerned. And they came at us with this structure. If you ever hear the word modernisation at the World of Work or reform, that's your time to start pulling the pin on the metaphorical hand grenades, because you know you're going to get it big style. So it was this idea that they're going to reform. And what they actually meant was all of the stuff that's happened in most of the rest of the economy, which I've described, precarious working, temporary contracts is going to come to the railway. We're going to smash the RMT and ASLEF, and we're going to replace them with an army of agency workers on 0 hours. And our members wouldn't have it. But the difference is, I think, between us and many other trade unions is that they were match fit, because we've always fought our corner. We've always been able to ballot. We've always been able to motivate our members and get them on the move, no matter what we were faced with by the hostile media and all the rest of it that we get. But we were concerned. You know, coming out of COVID, a lot of people were saying, well, I want to keep my head down, I want to earn some money, I want to get back to where I was. But we were delighted. We beat all those thresholds that they put in, these laws, continuous round of laws that we've had since Norman Tebbit in 1980. I think 5 pieces of primary legislation have been there to try and shackle the unions, and it's been successful in many cases. But what we did was went for the big push. We took 3 days of strike action, one after another, with a day in between, and our members came out in their thousands. We're a small union, small specialist trade union, but our members were out there on the picket lines. Thankfully it was a nice summer, on the picket lines all the way through. But the other thing that happened, everybody else came out as well, because I believe that working people, many of them veterans of our movement, but many of them, and just as many, people who are new to the idea of strike action, people who are actually coming up to our people and saying, how do you go on strike? How does it work? Do you get paid? Can they get rid of you? Straightforward questions. And again, not people in their teens, people who are in their 20s and 30s who've never experienced a high-profile industrial dispute. And I haven't got to teach anyone round here about high-profile industrial disputes, but there are many communities in our country, not just the soft southerners, you know, everyone says they don't know anything about it, but many of the former mining towns and villages and many of the former manufacturing areas in Britain, they've lost contact with our heritage, I believe. So we have to show them by doing, learning by doing, showing by example, what it can actually mean to fight back against the repressive employer, to fight back against these things that are portrayed as inevitable. It's inevitable that a computer is going to replace you. It's inevitable that your ticket office has to be closed. It's inevitable that we'll shut down all the services in your area and you have to go to some bot online to get any response from a service provider because we don't want any labour. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic. And what followed was, and if you follow all that media stuff that I was involved in and many of my officials were involved in, even the journalists didn't know what was going on. They had that famous thing with Kay Burley, if you remember it, do you not know how a picket line works? He had no conception. And it shows you how far our movement's gone away from having a profile. There are only 2 industrial correspondents in any of the mainstream media. And these people didn't have a clue. When they were turning up on the picket line, they were having to ask me what the dispute was about, and then try and make some notes and conduct an interview, which is very handy for me, because we can put the message over twice. But it shows you how far we've drifted away. When I was a kid, everyone knew who the General Secretary of the TUC was. Everyone knew who Jack Jones was. Everyone who knew Mick McGahey and Joe Gormley and all the rest of them, even Vic Feather and people like that have passed away into memory. We were live on the telly for a week. It was one of the highlights of my summer, watching the TUC as a small boy. Not really. But you know what I mean? We had people from our movement, and even those people that we might have called right-wingers back in the day. It's all relative, by the way, compared to what you've got now. Poor old Dennis Healy struggling away with world crisis. Jim Callaghan, of course, and Harold Wilson. People who had no compunction and no doubt about it was their duty to call people in a meeting a comrade, by the way. And now when you look back at what they achieved in all that crisis, I was reading about Michael Foot the other day. When they got power in 1974, the world was in crisis. Absolute energy shortages. We had a lot of industrial action here. The miners had just defeated the Tory government twice, which I think is a great achievement. Michael Foot was charged with bringing in some primary legislation. He brought in the Health and Safety at Work Act, one of the best pieces of legislation we've ever had. He brought in the Race Relations Act, brilliant piece of legislation, not perfect. He brought in the Sex Equality Act, all of which impinge on the world of work, by the way. They're great civil rights and human rights measures, but of course they affect us when we go to work. You're not allowed to be a racist employer anymore. You're not allowed to be, openly, I should say, a sexist employer anymore. And he brought in employment reform as well. He did that in 2 parliamentary sessions, the autumn one and the spring one. He was seriously ill as well, and he had no computers. How we can't get an employment rights bill through in the first year, it's going to take us 2.5 years under this government with all the resources we've got, is an embarrassment. And that was just some of the stuff they did without facing all the crises that were going on in the world. So if you want to do it, if you want to make meaningful change as a Labour politician, you can. And of course that doesn't even go back to the Attlee government and all the stuff that I'm sure you know about. They did it because they believed in it, because they were completely connected, even though we've got some criticisms of those people, completely connected with a party that was part of the working class movement. And there are lots of criticisms you can make, and we all do. But that dispute, I think, woke people up. It woke up an awful lot of people. And when we were out on strike, to begin with, the only people that were out with us were the barristers. I don't know if you remember the barristers' strike, all in the wigs and all that. I thought there'd be no coffee, but it turned out they were actually barristers, not people working in coffee shops. But to follow, and they were saying to me on these interviews, why should you get a pay rise? And I said, well, it's not actually about a pay rise, they're trying to take all of our conditions off us. So that's a longer argument for the average journalist. Why should you get a pay rise? The posties haven't got a pay rise, the nurses, I've got a list here, the doctors, the dockers, the barristers, the hospital consultants, the council workers, the ambulance staff, the teachers, all those private sector workers, and we had a fair few strikes then. None of them are getting a pay rise. Why should you get one? Lo and behold, over the next months and years, everybody came into this campaign because the message we were trying to give in very simple terms is we need a square deal at work. Britain needs a square deal from its employers. And if you see the way they're whinging this week, the employers, about paying a bit of national insurance, paying for the infrastructure of the country, paying for the health and welfare of their employees, it's no wonder they whinge, because they've won the argument over the last 4 decades. They've won the argument that this is a dog-eat-dog society, that it's every person for themselves. And I think what we managed to achieve as the RMT in leading that in some way was waking up some of that consciousness. Now we've got to make sure that we keep carrying it forward, which is why we've got to reinvigorate our movement. But they were convinced, and it shows pride becomes before a fall, politically as well, they were convinced that they would destroy the RMT in a fortnight, that on the picket lines, people would be walking past us, spitting at us, abusing us and all the rest of it, but they weren't. They were buying us stuff, they were spending time with us. There was a woman on the one at Euston that I used to go on with my son, painting pictures of us every time, giving out chocolates and all the rest of it, and that was happening all over the country. And I was delighted when what they called the summer of unrest, if only it went further, came about. Millions of people went on strike during that period, and millions of people were involved in ballots to go on strike, and many of them got success. The Daily Mail and the Telegraph were frothing at the mouth. They thought it was a revolution going to happen. They thought the world was going to end, and union barons, as we're called, were going to take over. Well, I detest that term, by the way, union baron. I was on the tools to the day I was elected as a full-time officer, working my shifts. If I'd known I was going to have an inheritance, I wouldn't have bothered all that time. I was going to inherit the role of the king of the RMT. But there was a real feeling, I think. But the problem in our movement is we didn't coordinate. We were faced with one of the most hostile governments in our history, probably the most right-wing government that we've ever come across in modern times. Were pushing Sunak even further than he wanted to go. And Shapps, remember him, Grant Shapps, what a lovely bloke he is. He's looking for 4 jobs now because he's got 4 identities now. He's lost his job. But he said on the radio just before I went on Radio 4, we're going to get an army of agency labour to replace all of the railway workers, and they're sacking themselves. Well, our union has grown since that time, and he's lost his job, so he sacked himself by taking us on. He went on to become the Minister of Defence, the Foreign Minister, the Minister without portfolio. He had about 19 jobs after he finished with the railways. But it did show what we didn't do, and I went to the TUC General Council and convinced them to create something called the Coordination Committee. And the idea of that was that all of these unions that were involved in campaigns on pay and conditions and all the rest of it, we would coordinate our action for a summer of discontent. It doesn't mean a general strike. I'd like to have seen a general strike, personally. But it could have meant that we synchronise it and sequence it so that we're constantly giving it to the other side about the need, not just for pay. And all these public sector workers said this. We need a pay rise because everyone's leaving. We need a decent set of terms and conditions to rescue the service that we work in, whether it be the NHS or education or whatever. We needed to coordinate that. And I managed to get them, me and Dave Ward from the CW, Matt Rack from the Fire Brigades Union and a few others, to get the TUC to convene this coordination committee. And you should have seen the trepidation and worry in their faces. But outside, when we got there this afternoon, with the Daily Telegraph, the Express, the Mail, BBC, all of them were there going, this is it, it's really going to happen. Unfortunately not, because there's too much self-interest in trade unions. Most of the health service unions, and I'm not going to name any of them because some of you might be in them, were saying, we never want to go on strike with another health service union. I found that extraordinary. The BMA were on strike, non-TUC union, and I was saying, let's speak to the BMA, try and get them to bring us into our movement, or at least work with them outside the movement so we can synchronise. Let's get the nurses, Royal College of Nursing, doing that extraordinary situation where the BMA and the Royal College of Nursing are taking heavy doses of strike action, and the TUC is going, well, they're not affiliates. I'm not going to talk to them. Extraordinary. But then the affiliated unions would not coordinate their action. We want our own day. And I said, well, you're in the Royal Society of Podiatrists. You're not going to get your own day. You need to be in with everyone else. The whole history of our movement is trying to make it as big as possible, not to dissipate it and make it as thinly spread as possible. Anyway, that didn't happen, but the upside is we got some good outcomes, and we've shown people that there is a way to fight back against all this nonsense. And I'm hoping that in the new pay round, which generally gets underway after January when people have sobered up a bit, we start talking about the pay rounds for April and May when all those anniversaries are in. Labour's got to deal with that, because the problems haven't gone away. We got some good results, but the problems of our health service, the problems of all our services have not gone away, and they're going to have to face up to a bit of collective bargaining that hopefully is forcefully presented. But the other thing we tried to do during that period, through things like the People's Assembly and this thing that we initiated with the CW, Enough is Enough, is to go out round the working class communities and represent some of the basic fundamentals of what we believe in. What does socialism mean for working people? But I'm not going to answer all that today, I haven't got enough time. Football results will be started later, but, you know, because people haven't heard our message for so long these days. Everyone believes that they're just a consumer. Everyone believes that they're just an individual out there. They believe that going on an EasyJet flight and navigating all that crap that you've got to do, which somebody used to do for you and be employed to do, is part of choice. And choice is a myth, because we're all being manipulated by algorithms. That's before AI. But people have bought into this, I think. There's a gross consciousness amongst working people that somehow you've got to find your own way, rather than all of us trying to find a better way, or whatever way you want to phrase it. And that was really successful. We went out to cathedrals, we went out to churches and chapels and mosques and temples all sorts of places where you thought you'll never hear a trade union or left-wing speech. And they were delighted to have us. Bishops, imams, good warriors, whatever. They were delighted to have us because you know who's delivering a lot of the services. And I was speaking to the organisers about the food bank here in Merthyr. Those civil groups, religious groups, faith groups, who are in our communities, they're doing a lot of that lifting. And it's not all churches. A lot of it is in other faiths are having to do that, having to deal with all workers of all types who cannot feed themselves. That's where we need to be. We need to be joining up all of that stuff across all the faith groups, people with no faith. And Beth's meeting was in a church and it was very apt. Packed out from people who never go to churches. That's where we need to be with the vicars and priests and rabbis or whoever it is that we need to be with. Because much of our beliefs and much of our principles come from those types of communities, and you know all that in this area in particular where that stuff comes from. And there's too much, in my opinion, on the left and in trade union circles, but particularly in political circles, too much purity, too much criticism of other people, too much ideology, if I'm frank with you. I'm sick of reading it. I've read it all. I've read every single paper on the left. And I'm sick of them selling them to me and selling them to each other. I don't know where all these papers go eventually. There must be a great left-wing recycling facility in the sky somewhere, because they're just reading criticism of each other and they're not speaking to real working people. And if we look at what's happened in the last couple of months with the upsurge of the far right, the levels of alienation in our society are at an all-time high, I think. People's confusion about what they should be and where the world's going really needs us to intervene. And the TUC did some interesting polling after the election. Really worrying in some ways, but interesting. If you take reform voters, and if we didn't have reform, we'd have an even more right-wing version. The BNP or the National Front would be back. Reform is blocking that in some ways. Respectability to outrageous right-wing and racist politics. Many people who vote reform believe in many of the things that we believe in. So they believe largely in public ownership of our services. All the stuff that we believe in, that Attlee and Bevan and all those people brought to us as a result of our movement, they believe in that. They believe in heavy levels of public spending. And if you ask them, they believe in fair taxation. So there's a really weird, confused identity amongst working class people. And they've fallen for the idea that it's the person coming on the boat rather than the person who's out buying a yacht that is the problem. And they don't understand the way that even basic economics works, the way that exploitation works, and the way that division is used in working class communities to take advantage of us. Now, in that sense, we've got to go back to the fundamental basics of what we believe in. Because before we had migration, we had religion. And if you go to Glasgow and other places, even places in England, I don't know what it's like in South Wales, they used to use religion against us. They said the Irish are coming, they're all Catholics, they're all Fenians, they're all Tims, and they're going to lower the wages, they're going to ruin the town or whatever. And we've had to beat it. We had to beat it in the 30s with Mosley and the fascists. We had to beat Mosley and the fascists again. I'm ignoring the war, it wasn't a small event. But Mosley came back in the 50s in the part of London that I lived in after the Notting Hill race riots, which were started by white racists, by the way, teddy boys. He came back then, nearly got elected. They came back again in the 60s and very strongly in the 70s under the National Front, and then the BNP in the 80s and 90s. We've had to get out there and beat them. But we don't just beat them by confronting them on big rallies. We beat them in places like this, in pubs, clubs, mess rooms as we call them on the railway, when you're having a cup of tea in your tea break at work and you hear all this stuff dripping out of people's mouths because they've got nothing else to say, it has to be challenged. Now, I don't want anyone getting into fist fights over the hobnobs and the Nescafe, but it has to be challenged properly as workers.
because that's the way it will be defeated. We have to embarrass people about being racists. We have to embarrass people about being bigots. And there's nobody else that can do it, by the way. Only the working class can do this job. And that's where we've got to start in reinvigorating our movement. And we've got to show them that the things that they can believe in about their public services and all the rest of it can only be delivered by a properly Labour government. And then we've got to move on to the Labour government and the Labour Party and sort them out. And I'm not going to dictate to people, and I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I haven't been a member of the Labour Party for nearly 40 years. There was a bloke from down this way that put me off. Remember him? Kinnock. He put me off. Was he down this way or was he a bit further away? I can't remember. But he did put me off. Kept going on and on and on about nothing. But the whole trend that we've seen since that time, the Blair Project and Mandelsonism and all the rest of it, which is now reached its height with Keir Starmer, has got to be challenged. It's up to us how you do it. And I know there are meetings going on in all sorts of areas from people that are disaffected, people that are fed up with the professionalisation of politics. And it's a real problem, by the way. They're all friends down there, a lot of them. Out of the 650 MPs, maybe 400 of them are close personal friends. It's a job. And they could probably do the job for either party. They're quite bright, some of them aren't. Jonathan Gullis, to name one, he wasn't very bright. But some of them are quite bright. They're actors. And if they lived in a different part of the world, they could be in the Labour Party just as easily as the Tories. That's my view. We've got to change that. We've got to make sure that our people are coming through. Our people are winning these selections. But it's up to you what you do about what party you're in. But we cannot be disconnected from the Labour Party, whatever we do. And my union is not affiliated to the Labour Party. It hasn't been for quite a while. And we're not going to be affiliated. But we're not disconnected. We write the policy stuff for them. Much of the stuff that's come through from Louise Haigh on rail, which I do welcome, and she's a good comrade of ours. She won't like me using that word because they'll probably throw her out because of it. Has come through from RMT representations that we've made, because the stuff that we come up with is really good. And we're going to have to support people like Louise Haigh, right? Even if you're not in the party, we're going to, I think, have to support people like Angela Rayner, because they will turn on them eventually. It was only a matter of time till they have a purge of anyone that wants to get something done in line with the stuff that we believe in. So there's a job to be done. And I think what that means is the trade unions have to stand up again as an independent movement. And I mean this really seriously. We are not a client of the Labour Party. We are not even going to financially support the Labour Party if they don't do the stuff that we want. Now, we don't expect it all done in the first week, but we expect a continual programme of reform in favour of working people. Now, we've got a Labour group, RMT, even though we're not affiliated, of more than 50 MPs, and hopefully that will grow. Many other unions are following our example now. And we have to put all these politicians under manners. If they want to continue getting working class votes, they've got to deliver a working class agenda. And that is going to have to mean more progressive taxation, more investment in our services, and a continual redistribution of wealth. That's what progressive taxation is, and how it's delivered is through the structures that are important to our people in our society. So there's a big job to be done in that section. But the way we deliver that, I think, is being unafraid of balloting for industrial action, unafraid of taking industrial action, and unafraid of coordinating industrial action when it needs to be done. And next year's public sector pay round could be the start. But we must, as I say, get back into the private sector, because only 22%, I think the figure is, of British workers are now covered by collective agreements. And in the private sector, it's down to very few. And many of them are in the traditional former public sector areas. So that's what we've got to do. It's a task, and it's not going to be easy, but we've got to commit ourselves to doing it. Because if you see what's coming next, It's like the Hammer House of Horrors. We've just had it announced there that Badenoch and Generic have sorted out their differences, which don't seem to be any, by the way, and they've made their choice. Well, whatever choice they've made, it's a short straw for working people if they ever get back into power, because that party is going to go to the right again, and it's going to be pushed there by Farage, sitting behind them on the back benches and being the star of the show at Tory conferences and Tory rallies. Because Badenoch is a robot, as far as I can perceive. She's just going to be fed policies that are more and more outlandish and more right-wing as she goes along. So we've got this situation on the front bench with somebody who is more right-wing than even Truss. We've got on the back bench, we've got Farage feeding all that nonsense, and on the streets, hopefully not for a while, the Tommy Robinson Brigade trying to stir up hatred in our communities. So we've got to make sure that we're strong, that we're able to respond to all that agenda, not just physically, as I've described, but in terms of our ideas. And what that will mean is explaining to working class people what a Labour government could achieve if it chose to. And if you take things like the Green New Deal that we were going to get, which was dropped at the first whiff of resistance, that could have transformed working class communities. It could have made working class housing, former council housing or whatever, fit for the 21st century. It could have lowered your bills by doing that. It could have trained an army of working people to do all that skilled work. Instead, it's just going to be left to the market. You're all going to go out and afford a heat pump for 15, 20 grand a crack in each terraced house in Merthyr Tydfil. Well, I'd love to see it happening through market forces. It's just not good enough. And they've got to come back to that stuff, and they've got to be honest. If we want the services we need, we're going to have to tax everyone, not just the rich. Working class people have got to pay proper tax. Middle class people have got to pay proper tax. And the ruling class and the oligarchs and the corporations have got to pay the appropriate tax for the society that we live in. And that is called struggle. That is coming up with a theory and making sure that you deliver that agenda by educating the people that are going to support you. Now, that will be a challenge. And what I always say to people is, if you're not in a union, you need to join one. If you're in a union and are passive, you've got to change that. You've got to make your union work for yourself. You've got to make your union political if it chooses not to be political. There cannot be, in the future, non-political trade unions. The idea that we somehow live in this vacuum of terms and conditions or pay and nothing else affects us, like the BMA and the Royal College of Nursing has done for the last 100 and whatever years, has been a nonsense. Because people who never thought of themselves as working class have now discovered that they are working class. Because the only way that you can get what you need is through proper organisation. And it's a lesson that middle class people seem to have learned. But our working class people seem to have either forgotten the lesson or have never had it. So in my union, we're going to be working on ways where we get out all the time, out of the offices, out of the committee rooms. Less talk and more work. We've got to be in the places where working people are, converting them to our ideas, making them active trade unionists, running the campaigns that are going to deliver for our people and getting some success. And we did that. During the rail dispute, we had this campaign about ticket offices. Thankfully, Transport for Wales never went down that road, because you've got a different type of government. Nor did they in Scotland, and nor did they in London, some of the measures where we had Labour and nationalist jurisdictions. We turned round the Tory campaign. They had to completely abandon it. They had to completely abandon the idea that there's going to be a de-staffed railway. Well, we need to do that in the NHS. We need to do that in the education services. We need to do that in the care services and in the councils. We need to get back to the idea that direct provision by council and health service workers without privatisation is the model that we want to see. because it makes better communities and it makes for better outcomes from those services. And that means investment, but it also means that we've got to do the work to push back the idea that privatisation in some way is a solution for our society. If you look at the winter fuel crisis that we had a couple of years ago, not the one that the Labour Party's having at the minute, but the actual fuel crisis where the prices went up, not one Labour politician that I'm aware of stood up and said, you know, we used to own all of that. British Petroleum, British Gas, the Electricity Generating Board, the National Grid, everything, all of it used to be in public ownership. And what would we have done, or what could we have done if it was still in public ownership? We could have set the price, either for the people who need it or for everybody. And that includes industry, by the way. Starmer never mentioned it, Reeves never mentioned it. Barely anyone mentioned the merits of public ownership. The idea of public ownership was born in these areas because they experienced private ownership before the welfare state. We have to get back to the idea and win the argument that public ownership is good in and of itself, that the redistribution of wealth is good in and of itself. It's good for the people that are getting the benefits of it directly, but it's also good for the whole of society. It makes a better balanced society if the differences between the rich and the poor are addressed. So there's tons to be done, but I think there's hope. I think out there, if you dig under the superficial that we've been put through since Thatcher came in, and I still believe we're living under Thatcherism now, all of that change that she succeeded in doing, in remodelling industry, remodelling or demodelling industry might be the term because you got rid of it, but remodelling the economy so that we're a service economy, so that we're expected to paint each other's nails and tattoo each other and buy coffee. That's the way the economy works now. We don't make anything. Extraordinary. She succeeded in doing that, but she also succeeded up there with a lot of people. She succeeded in this idea of dog eat dog. She succeeded that it's just me, that I pull the ladder up. I don't want you getting what I've got. Well, we've got to win that battle back. Marx said this, don't often quote that. We've got to win the battle of ideas. What idea have we got for this society? Do we want a society that's better for everyone, or do we want a society that's better than the few? And I think better for the few. I think you had a speaker who coined that phrase in an election recently. So I'm very hopeful, because I think if we do the work, we can win back working people, and we can create a mass, vibrant labour movement. And that will include everything, the politicians, the workers and their trade unions, but also culturally, to get the artists, to get the sports people, to get the poets and the musicians into our movement. People that are prepared to stand up and say, I identify with this because it's where I'm from. We've got a world now where footballers won't say anything. Never have said much. But we've got thousands of black footballers, for instance, not speaking out about the state of their communities. We've got all these working class people achieving stuff that are told you must keep all that to yourself. In fact, the reason that they achieved all that is because of the systems that we put in earlier ages of the labour movement. So Labour's elected now, and we've got to make the most of it, I'm afraid. I don't know what people want to hear from me, that I'm going to start a new organisation here in this room. I'm not going to do that. We've got to win this struggle in our movement. We've got to make them look over their shoulders to the left, not just to the right, to the business community. They found it a bit shocking since they've come in about how hostile the right-wing press and the right-wing media and the owners of this economy are. When you're in that position, I think you should look to your own people for support. That's what I would do in my background. But Starmer and Reeves seem to be intent on running this managerial form of politics that's got no political content in it. Well, I don't think that works in the big bad world. I think they've come a cropper on the two-parent cap, and I'm glad all those Labour MPs that have been denied the whip are all members of the RMT Labour group, so that shows you something. That they've done terrible things with the winter fuel allowance, and of course, even on the principled stuff out there, on Palestine and international relations, they've shown that they're just as reactionary as anyone else out there, and it's very difficult for workers to tell the difference. If you line yourself up with Netanyahu and Trump and Badenoch on international relations, you know you're taking the wrong direction as far as I'm concerned. So we've got to make sure that our movement is taking them to account. Thank you very much. Is putting them to account, that our movement is vibrant enough to stand up to the challenges ahead of us. I believe that we can do it. I believe that all of you can do it in these communities. But we've got to stick together. We've got to get back to the idea that we believe in unity, that we believe in solidarity, that we are one class, and it's in our interests to act as a class. We are not just consumers. We are not just the subject of the algorithm. We've got a part to play in the way that the world works, and I believe we can build a better world than the one we've got, and I think the future's in our hands, as it's always been. Because socialism means the world for the workers, and we've got to make sure that happens soon. So thanks for listening to me, and enjoy your afternoon. Cheers.